All right. So, you guys have heard of the word bias before, yes? What's bias?
It's like your opinion on something. Influencing. Yeah.
Okay. The bias we're going to talk in this class is not personal bias. It's going to be statistical bias. Okay? But there is some things that one of the things I want us to know is like bias is not just like, oh, the person running the study is trying to make something happen. Okay? So the first thing we need to understand about bias is it's not about an individual's response, it's a systematic favoring of results of a response. And that does not make it intentional. Okay? And that, like, so we kind of, like, in the personal biases that people have, sometimes it kind of comes across that people are intentionally, like, neglecting one group or another. In statistical bias, okay, usually it's not intentional. Usually it's an oversight. Okay, it's not the people designing a study rarely want it to be unreliable and have bad data. It just happens sometimes. Okay, now the first type of bias that we can get is called voluntary response bias, and it basically happens when people choose to be in a sample. So let's talk about why that's a problem. An example might be Mr. Belk wanting to know how people feel about study hall release. You with me? If he said, how do you feel about whether or not kids should be allowed to leave for study hall? Who's he going to hear from? Which students? Freshmen, sophomores. Why?
Because they killed me.
And,
They're mad.
huh?
They're mad.
And they're mad. Are you guys with me? Okay? So here's the deal. If people are happy with the status quo, they're not going to respond to a voluntary response bias. Do you guys, or they're not going to respond. Mm-hmm. It's usually the most extreme responders, if that makes sense. And sometimes we talk about, like, it really is people with strong opinions. And so it makes people feel like the responses then look way more polarized than what's actually. Do you guys see what I'm saying here? Okay, that's voluntary response. Cool? Undercoverage. Undercoverage happens when groups are left out of the sampling process. Sometimes we call that the sampling frame. So guys, remember when I said, can I just ask my students? The answer was no, because? freshmen were left out? And likewise, could I just ask study halls? The answer was no, because they're not that juniors and seniors don't go to study hall, but they definitely would be underrepresented because of that. Okay, that's an example of under coverage. Is this okay? All right. Non-response happens when people don't respond. Okay. For this one, I'm going to give you this example. Let's go ahead and say that as a school, we want to know, do kids feel that they were prepared for their next steps post-high school? So what we're going to do is we're going to say, were you, we send out a survey to people who graduated 5 years ago and say, can you reflect over the past 5 years and what do you wish we would have done differently? Are you guys with me? Mm-hmm. Okay. And we send it out to all 100 kids who graduated. Probably was more like 80, but we'll use 100 because it makes numbers easy. And we only received responses from 60. And they all said, yep, I was prepared. Should I assume that for those 60 people who said, yep, I was prepared, that it's 100%? Because the 40 who didn't respond are probably different systematically from the 60 who did. Do you guys see what I'm saying now? Does that kind of make sense of why it's a big deal? All right. All right. Response bias happens when responses aren't truthful. All right, you guys. Do not answer this question. I do not want to know your answer, especially because I've taught some of you in the past. If I were to say to a group of my students, I'm trying to figure out what percent commit academic dishonesty. Could I ask you guys if you've ever cheated on a math test? Should I be the one asking you that question?
No.
Why not?
You teach us.
Because I teach you, yes. Would you lie to me?
If you cheat, you probably would lie.
Yeah.
Do you guys see what I'm saying? Now, how could I do it better?
Get someone else to ask it.
Get someone else to ask
Student.
and do it anonymously so that I don't know who said yes or no. Do you guys see what I'm saying? Have you guys remember, have you ever taken some of those like drug and alcohol surveys?
Yeah.
Right? How many times have you tried alcohol in the past 24 hours? How many times have you tried alcohol in the past week, month, 6 months? Why do they ask you so many times? Not only that, if let's say the average is once in a week, do you know what those survey people think? It's at least twice. Why would they think that? Because people tend to underestimate. Even, that doesn't mean they're lying. It's that they maybe don't, underestimate for themselves, right? They're not aware. They're kind of like, when there's a moral implication involved in an answer, people tend to maybe, when they know that there's a right answer, in air quotes, they tend to give the right answer instead of the truthful answer. You guys get what I'm saying there? Which is why in the past 5 elections when people were surveyed in advance about were they going to vote or not, there were 70% of people said they voted when in actuality it was only 40%. Why does that happen? Because are we supposed to vote? Mm-hmm. In air quotes, right? Okay. Do you guys see how this works? and all of those are different response biases, a lot of times implying some sort of like there is the answer I'm supposed to give, as opposed to the answer I'm good, that's actually the truthful answer. Okay? And this is a good place to stop. All right. So on, Friday, we talked about all these different ways we can introduce bias into a sample. We got one more that we didn't quite get to yet. Today's going to be a little bit of notes and then a decent amount of practice on AP Classroom, except for we're going to do AP Classroom a little bit differently in that I'm going to project them and we're going to do them as a group so that so that I get a little bit of better feel for where you guys are and we don't have to deal with all the I logged in or whatever. And I want to give you more feedback per question is basically a big piece of it, okay? So convenient sampling is exactly what you would think it is. It's when you get data from a sample that is easy to access.
What does that mean?
So, for example, you guys, if I wanted to gather data from students for Grandview, I could just be like, oh, I got a group of kids right here. You guys I have pretty easy access to your opinions because all I have to do is ask them, yeah?
It's like taking it without taking into account, like, the whole group you're trying to get.
Pretty much, yeah. Pretty much. It could be, oh, I'm just going to go stand at the door and ask kids as they walk by. But the problem with that is whatever makes the sample convenient usually makes them different from the population as a whole. You guys being in my classroom right now makes you different from the general population of the school. This is an upper level course. This is you guys see what I'm saying? Okay. All right. So next I want to take you through kind of like the difference between E's and P's, because in this specific unit, the difference between an E and a P is really important. It's going to pop up over and over and over again, and it seems to be the place where kids struggle the most. Is this okay? All right. So I'm going to let you guys read this context right now. So this is our first time where we're actually not just like processing information. Here's what I want you guys to be thinking through as you read this context. What is the whole variable of interest in this study to begin with?
Saying yes or no, like agreeing or disagreeing with
Yeah. Agreeing or disagreeing with the boycott. Now, what do you guys think the number one wrong answer I get for this is? Immigration law. Now, does immigration influence whether or not people agree or disagree with this boycott? Sure. Is that the underlying, is that an underlying thing? Sure. Okay? All right. Now, so can you guys, first of all, you guys think this actually represents what Los Angelans, is that like New Yorkers is New Yorkers. I don't think it's Los Angelesers. It's Los Angelesians. What is it? Los Angeles? What is it?
citizens of Los Angeles.
Yeah. What is Columbus?
Angelinos?
Los
Los
Angeles.
Angelenos? Los Angelans.
Los Angeles. Okay. Guys, what's that group from Columbus called? I always think
Columbusians.
Columbusites. That sounds like parasites, though, which feels a little bit icky. Yeah.
Columbusers. Same with like Hong Kong. People are like, what do you call someone from Hong Kong? It's like
Columbusite.
just separated.
Columbian.
I don't like Colombian. That feels icky.
Columbusite.
No,
Columbusite is, I think,
Colombian's already a thing.
That's what it says, Columbusite.
Columbus.
so we are Columbusites, y'all.
Ew. I sound like a thing you start coughing from.
It does.
I sound like something I'd look up on the web.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Okay, anyway. All right, so anyway. Do you think this survey is representative?
Maybe not.
No? Can you guys tell me some potential problems with it?
It would be like a response, not a response bias. It would be a voluntary response bias.
This definitely is voluntary response. That's one problem. Yeah?
Since it's online, it means that only people who have access to internet can take it.
Okay, so the fact that it's online limits access, which essentially causes some undercoverage. Yeah?
Since it's the news, it will be like only old people.
Only old people because of news? Okay. I mean, Dylan, I watch the news. What are you saying?
Dylan, do you watch
Dylan.
the news?
How about this? This is going through the newspaper's website, yes? Do newspapers have a bend themselves? Do you guys see what I'm saying? Who goes to the newspaper's websites? They're readers, right? I promise you the readers of the New York Times are different than the readers of the Washington Post, are different from the Wall Street Journal. Do you guys see what I'm saying there? Mm-hmm. Okay. New York Times tends to be fairly left-leaning. Wall Street Journal is very right-leaning. Do you guys get what I'm saying here? And so the newspaper might have a bend, might be biased. And therefore the people who read it are getting biased news to begin with. Like, you guys get what's going on here? Okay. All right. Now, what else?
There's a lot more people in Los Angeles than just 4,100.
Well, so no matter what, your sample is always going to be smaller than your population anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You with me? So, like, the size of your sample, believe it or not, it matters, but it doesn't matter in the sense of making it representative. Like, you could have 10 people who are very representative of Los Angelans' opinions.
These are people who only read the newspaper.
Exactly. Okay. So, guys, if all of these things, very good reasons, we could list every single one of them, we would still have a P on this question. Because here's the thing about bias. If we're going to say, oh, that's biased, we don't just say where the bias is coming from. We say, what is that bias doing to the responses? Is this okay? Remember we said, what do we know about voluntary response samples in general? Strong, usually negative opinions, yes? Is everybody with me? Knowing that, do you think this 96% is too high or too low? Is it an overestimate or an underestimate? Probably an overestimate. Why? Because the people who disagree with the ban
Are going to say something about it.
are going to say something about it way more than the people who do. They're going to be louder. They're going to be more likely. Does that make sense? So if you want to get an E on this question, you're going to do one of these things. And any one of these things would be a justification for the source of the bias. But you also have to talk to me about the direction of the bias. Okay? Okay, so we might say this method overestimates the percent who disagree with the ban. Because voluntary response samples tend to have stronger and more negative results. And I'm going to say instead of results, opinions. Do you guys see the difference there in terms of... Now, here's your other rule of thumb. When you're done with your question, cover up the context and read your answer. If your answer could be applied to any question, it's not good enough. It's a P. So, for example, no, because voluntary response samples tend to be... Or if I said, does this result in opinions? If I said no, it overestimates it because voluntary response samples tend to be stronger and more negative. Have I ever said anything about the context? Do you guys see what I'm saying? Like, that could apply to a new context. If it could apply to a new context, you don't have enough detail in it. Okay, so when describing a bias, you're going to describe two things. You're going to describe the source of the bias. Okay? Now, you do not need to use the phrase voluntary response sample. Okay? You could say this method results in a higher estimate than what's probably true because people went online and made the choice to be a part of the sample, and the people who would choose would have stronger, more negative opinions. Like, you don't need to remember the names of all these different types of biases, okay? You just have to say, you can describe it in words instead. Cool? All right. Not only do you describe the source, you also have to describe the direction of bias on the response bias on the variable of interest. How are we feeling so far?
Do like newspapers actually take this stuff into account when they publish? Like, when you read an article and it has all these statistics from took this poll and this poll and this poll, do they have to be well, if we step away from the data, it could be a voluntary response bias or no? No.
I would not.
If it fits their bottom line.
I would not characterize. So here's what I would say. Certain polls. So newspapers rarely do their own poll, and if they do, you shouldn't. They're not professional statisticians. I'd be very leery about something that the newspaper itself did the poll. Instead, they typically, there's different polling agencies that the newspapers report out on. There are certain ones that have great reputations, and there are some who are meh. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So with you read an article and you say, and it's doing the Quinnipiac poll, which is a famous one, okay? You can look up the method. When you get to a poll, you can find out the method of it. You can find out what was their sampling method, what question did they ask, those kinds of things. Typically, most pollsters have a rating. Quinnipiac's pretty high. Reuters is Reuters is a news agency. So certain ones, they're not coming off the top of my head right now, but there are certain polling agencies that when you're oh, it's a poll from this place, I feel very good about it. Likewise, polling agencies, if we're talking politically, political parties have their own polling agencies as well. Campaigns do their own polling as well. Now, that being said, campaigns usually do not lie about their polling numbers. Or they have a good method because they also want to be able to use those polling numbers to make decisions on how they're going to campaign and all those kinds of things. They themselves don't want false data, right? I think where you might find potential sources of bias is how much certain polls are emphasized versus others, right? It's certainly all over the place, though. For sure, it's all over the place. And being like a skeptical consumer of information is always a good thing. Can we talk about this one real quick? A local school board plans to conduct a survey of parents' opinions about year-round schooling. So this was on the 2008 test. Guys, there is guaranteed to be one free response question from this unit on the AP exam. It's guaranteed. I can find every single test. I can go back and find something from this unit. Okay? So I'll let you guys read it. So, survey got sent out to 500 families. 98 responded. Hey guys, which families are the ones who are going to respond?
The ones who want it.
Either the ones who want change, or the ones who when you get a survey, you throw it away, right? Unless it's on something that you care a lot about. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So in general, you think the families who responded are the ones that are super involved or non-involved?
Super involved.
These are super involved families. Yeah? Does that make sense? And they probably value schooling more. So the negative consequence of the non-response bias is probably those 98 families care more than the ones who didn't respond. Okay? So and the consequence of that is now looking at the sample, 76 out of 98, do you think that's too high or too low? Too high. So you would want it, that consequence is going to be that we are overestimating the percent of families that would support year-round school. Does this make sense? Mm-hmm. Here, so I'm going to say this method. No, it's not really. The non-response How we feeling so far? How would you guys feel about year-round school?
Well, they do it in purple, right?
What if it didn't equal more school days? So it would be like, oh, you have a 9 weeks on and then 3 weeks off, and then 9 weeks on and then 3 weeks off.
I think I'd like it.
I know we'd be like coming up on a 3-week break right now
I think I'd
because we're about
appreciate
9
that
weeks into this year.
instead of having to like, because over the summer
I
we
would
forget
have it
about
all
stuff.
in
Yeah,
one
because
day,
over the
yeah.
summer you do
Just-
forget
Yeah, I like it
a
all.
lot of stuff.
Yeah, like,
Maybe more times
Just
for
like-
like
generally when you
like
attend a quarter,
smaller
it's
trips
not
instead of like
Yeah.
having to
your
spend
end
all
of
your money on big
unit.
things.
In every class.
And
So
you
that-
It would change the way we plan things for sure.
And there
So
wouldn't
that in
be
the
like
3 weeks
summer
you
work.
You
You
have
would
like
just
a, yeah, you have like
It'd just be like regular homework over the weekend.
and you like having a bunch of
I'm a fan. I would love it.
okay with multiple spring breaks. I would.
That's the thing, right? Like you would still have 6 weeks off in the summer probably. I would love it.
We should do it.
I just made the decision. It's done. All right. Hey guys. So they have a sample they asked 500 people. They had a sample that only had 98 respond. If they asked 500 more people, is that okay?
No.
What's going to happen when they ask 500 more people?
The same
Same
thing.
thing that happened the first time.
So if I were to describe, is this a good idea? We're all on the same page of no.
Nothing wrong was changed.
Now let's talk about the explanation. Okay, so in order to explain this well, we don't want to just say nothing's changed, though it's true, right? That's still not it doesn't really address, let's put it this way, no, nothing has changed could apply to a lot of different contexts. Okay, so that really is your rule of thumb. If I took this question away and put this answer down, okay, does that make sense? So I might say, this change does not address the families who are less involved. They are the group whose opinion on year-round school we still need. Now, why do you guys think I added that last sentence?
Context.
What's the variable of interest in this? The opinion on year-round school. So you need to somehow address that. Okay? Do you guys see what I'm saying? Like this is like one of those subtle, annoying College Board quirky units where there's a lot of quirkiness in it. Okay? All right. What about part C?
I don't know, like a mandatory one.
Mandatory, maybe not, but can I, if I asked you guys to fill out a survey and only 3 of you do it, which, I'm not going to lie, has happened, okay? What do I do next?
Ask it. Just to-
Go after the people who didn't do it.
Go after the people who didn't do it, yeah? Hey, I really need you to answer this so I can do this later, right? Did you guys see what I'm saying there? Okay, so I would say follow up with the families who didn't respond. In a new manner. For example, phone call. Note home with the child. Home visit.
Ooh, I don't like that one.
Me neither. Guys, if I had to go visit a child's home, that would feel very icky. But you get the premise, yeah?
Yeah.
And ask opinion. On your own. You feeling okay? Does this feel reasonable?